on Peacebuilding in Africa. My name is Schoeman. I'm from the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. Our three speakers this afternoon, most of you will be familiar with them. Dr. Comfort Cheryl, who is the Program Director for Africa at the International Crisis Group. Do you need any introduction? Our very dear colleague and friend who also arranged this afternoon seminar, Dr. Funmi Olonisakin, here from King's College, and of course now also a member of the UN Secretary General's advisory panel on the UN's peacebuilding architecture. And I'm sure we're all very keen to hear what she has to say and eventually to read that report. And then my very close neighbor, and although in another town or city, we live in the same place, Professor Cheryl Hendricks, who heads the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. It's also wonderful to see so many familiar faces here, from students who are students here now, or some of them who came back to South Africa, but who is here on loan for a little while. It's good to see all of you, friends from Kenya. It's almost like a reunion. Funmi has asked me that we try and keep this short because we've got the three presentations and we would like to leave some time for discussion on the basis of these presentations. So I am immediately going to hand over to Comfort and ask her to start off our discussion for this afternoon, and she will be followed by Cheryl, and then Funmi will round up for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you to Funmi for once again she's going to give me instructions and I obey very well. But it's always a pleasure to come back to the other place where I worked and to take part in discussions with colleagues and friends. So we have 10 minutes to talk, and I will try and keep my opening statements very brief. We've just come back actually from 3 days of conversations on peace building, and I mean I would avoid summarising it, but I think there were some interesting takeaways and things to note from that would sharpen my mind about the state of play. The state of play for a number of doctrines and norms and principles that supposedly govern the way the international community operates and governs the way in which we try to help countries come out of conflict. And I think one big takeaway for me was that peace building, along with other key doctrines and principles like peacekeeping, conflict prevention, and international justice, are at a crossroads. That these key norms that we espouse to are under significant threat, significant challenges. And that's what's clear in the last few years, and I think situations like Ukraine, Syria, even though we tend to talk about, our reference point is Africa, but I think there are other extreme examples, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves that it's not also grim on the continent. But if you ever wanted to understand the fate or the strains or the complexities, the challenges that govern the international global system, then Ukraine and Syria, I think, are the most extreme of those. Everything that we understood, all the norms that we hold dear to, I think that they've gone under severe knock with Ukraine and Syria. We thought that was very much true with Rwanda and the DRC and Liberia, and we started to try to rewrite the script. And I think we're at a turning point where we are having to rewrite the script and rewrite a number of those principles that emerged in the 90s and the 2000s in response to a number of conflicts on this continent. For so long, we believed that Africa was the laboratory, was the launching pad for a number of new ideas in international governance, and certainly in terms of how to respond to fragility. But I think we can also add others important case studies to that listening. So I think the three things I would say is that the doctrines are derailed or under significant strain. The governance structures that govern the rules by which the international society operates are not thrown out the window, but there are some countries, i.e. Russia, that are seeking to rewrite that. And I think underpinning this is the new conflicts. But some of them are new, and I think we agree that some of them are new, but some old conflicts have re-emerged again, which raises a question about the whole enterprise of peace building. Because we are now 10 years on the anniversary, 10 years later, of this institution called the Peacebuilding Commission. And the very reason that it came to existence is now under significant strain, because its reason for existence was to prevent the reoccurrence of conflict. And I think we can point to a number of conflicts that have either not subsided or where the tools that we've tried to experiment with have not done enough to end their conflict. And I know Cheryl is going to talk about DRC and Burundi, and in fact we're on the eve of very contentious elections in Burundi, where one has to wonder whether the preventative mechanisms that peace building has at its core will be enough to prevent a serious rebellion. I also think that the kind of conflicts that we deal in today require us to not necessarily throw out the tools and mechanisms, but to rethink how they're deployed and whether they're right for deployment in certain cases. I mean, two examples for me come to mind, specifically on the continent, on South Sudan, where the early warning mechanism of the UN system was shown to be fundamentally wanting in not being able to detect, react quickly to the crisis that led to the 15th of December 2013 civil war there in that country. The Central African Republic, where you did have the UN instrument in the form of the Peacebuilding Commission, again missed the rebellion of December 2012 and completely turned a blind eye to what became the coup that happened in March 2013. And where was the international community, and where was this instrument that it claimed that it had under the Peacebuilding Commission, where was it in terms of responding to the crisis? So I think there are a number of lessons that we need to learn. I think that it's worth asking ourselves, what have we learned in the last 10 years? I think it's worth asking ourselves, what are the challenges today? Are there any opportunities? And where we see the next trends and what we think we can do better. I think it's clear to say in the last few years, given the context also of Mali and the Sahel, that the conflicts today are certainly growing rapidly, outpacing our ability to respond to them, outsmarting some of our tools, and unraveling our response mechanisms as well. A number of us proclaimed Mali as being on the verge of democracy, and were blindsided by the rebellion that happened. And then we've tended to look at it as a response or as a consequence of Libya, without actually looking at what was going on inside the country, to see that a lot of the peace building attempts that made there unraveled pretty quickly, because it didn't have any institutions to absorb the shock of the regional threat posed to it by Libya, or the return of fighters to the country as well. It's also clear that we've made, I think, and I say particularly given the organisation that I work in, that we've made a significant lack of investment in what it means to prevent. So all the institutions, the UN, the African Union, particularly the ECOWAS, SADC, all our key institutions, whether they're African or European or the UN, we talk the talk of prevention, but yet when it comes to prevent, we fail, and I think spectacularly. And I think in the last 2 years, we can list a significant array of examples. I can think of the most recent, Burkina Faso. All the writing was on the wall for what eventually happened. No surprises, and yet our mechanisms were too slow or blindsided or too complacent in reacting. And we failed to implement a lot of these principles and norms as well. I think also, and this goes specifically to the heart of peace building as a norm, it's clear that we have focused too much, but I think Cheryl may challenge me on this, but I think we focus too much on this notion of state building and not really come down to the next layer and understand what peace building means. And I think for me what you were saying, where we all take our cue from, is that we haven't understood how to build that trust between state and society, that we haven't understood what it means, state societal, that these are fractured communities, and yet much of our engagement tends to be at a very top level, tends to be also with the executive, it tends to be less to do with parliament or other institutions, but very much focused around the presidency, as though the presidency itself, which considers a lot of these ideas a threat to its own survival, would be willingly wanting to engage. And you're also asking elites to rethink the way they govern in a way that threatens their very survival as well. And I think that's one of the lessons and takeaways that I've understood in the last few years. Also, I don't think any of the tools that we have necessarily accommodate this new language that we're seeing called radicalization. I don't quite see in the litany of in the toolbox how we can now begin to do terrorism, jihadism, all these new words. And I think that we need to pause for a moment to think about how we're going to maneuver our way around these new threats. But having said that, I think this is what we have learned over the last few years, and whether it will help contribute to the work that Funmi is doing and to rethink peace building under this review will also be useful. And Funmi, I think you said it yourself in our conversation this week, that we need to really unpack the myth of local ownership. Because at the end of the day, while we talk local ownership, the ownership really is about the national authority, and the national authority meaning the president. So it's very interesting to me how another idea that's supposed to speak about inclusivity has been hijacked and held hostage to this group of people who supposedly represent us, but in fact they don't really represent or even understand the wider, deeper fractures in communities as well. So it's very interesting to me that we are seeing, my conclusion from what you said for me is that we are seeing a resurgence of sovereignty, but in a slightly different way from what we know it, and it's now couched in this word of local ownership, and we say it because it sounds like the important thing to say, but when we scrutinise it, we realise that it's actually a very top tier local ownership as well. I think also we need to review what's inside the box, the toolbox of peace building. The one that I think we definitely need to pause on is election, because it's very clear to us in the last few years that the elections have become more conflict-inducing as opposed to being the path to rebuild peace. I say it in the context of Ivory Coast. I say it in the context of what could potentially happen in Burkina Faso is the moment right for that country to go to elections. I say also in the context of South Sudan, the idea that South Sudan is even talking about elections this year is almost enemy. And then the Central African Republic, somehow elections have become as an exit strategy. Well, we know France wants to exit. Is this the way in which to exit? By imposing an election on a country that has never successfully held peaceful elections, is this the appropriate way in which to help this country rebuild itself? I also think that we need to look at other instruments around disarmament, demobilization and reintegration. We learned this week from one of our other colleagues that Mozambique was the poster child for post-conflict reconstruction. But yet the weakest link and why we're in crisis today is because of disarmament as well. We're finding that not a lot of the ex-combatants really have their tools and weapons taken away from them as well. So that's one of the lessons that I think that we've learned. The most fundamental, and I think it goes to the heart of what we do on the continent for me and what you've been very much about, is the transformative component of peace building. How transformative has it been? The poster child, again, for a lot of this tends to be Sierra Leone and Liberia. But I would beg to differ. I mean, from a peacekeeping perspective, I think there's much to be said about the success of that. And I was part of it, and so I would like to say that we did well. But from a peace building perspective, those of you who are watching the fallout from the Ebola crisis in Liberia, well, the one thing I took away from Liberia during the height of the Ebola crisis was the return of the language of the war. It was very clear that the deep fault lines of the Liberian society hadn't been dealt with, and that all the frustrations of society around corruption, around poor governance, now began to crystallize around Ebola, because it was a perfect example that the government itself hadn't moved beyond Monrovia to ensure that it had managed to tackle a number of those local grievances as well. I think the other thing that we've learned, and I would struggle to walk away with, is that no matter which way you look at it, security first is fundamental. I don't think we can do anything that we do without actually putting security first. Now, some people may read that as stabilization, but I don't go that far. I think you need the environment in which to start doing peacebuilding in a serious manner. I think the final lesson I think I would want to focus on is that no single institution itself can do peacebuilding. The focus on institutions at home, in the countries, but also regionally, I think they're significantly fragile. And we need to work out the division of labour to decide who is involved in the whole cast of characters that do peacebuilding. But I think the terrain has been complicated, because 10, 15 years ago there weren't that many people doing peacekeeping, peacebuilding. It would tend to be the preserve of what is like the UN. And today the environment has become a lot more messy, coordination's become more complicated. In the CAR alone, you have 3 different kinds of international forces that are supposed to be providing security, and then you have a number of other institutions that are supposed to help the country overcome its own crisis. And then the final, I think there are 2 final things I'd like to say on the lessons learned. So we have to also understand the limits of our intervention. But I think we have to be honest about how far we think we can help and build. We can potentially lay the foundation, but what does that foundation look like as well? And then finally, the big takeaway this week was that, to coin, was it Clinton who said it's the economy stupid? Well, in our business, it's politics stupid, and there's a tendency in which to be very technical and to have a checklist approach to how you're going to fix the state. The idea that you think you can fix DRC is a novelty, I think, to most of us. And the idea that you're not engaging with politics at all levels, whether it's national, local, or regional, I think is a challenge. So I think from there, I think it's pretty straightforward to work out what the challenges are and the overarching issues that Funmi has to confront in her work. I think the inability in the future of peacebuilding to think about the root causes of conflict. Now we've been saying it forever and ever, and people think it's a shorthand for saying, well, you don't understand. But I think it's actually deeper than that. That we really don't understand. We really miss some of the key events in a society. That's because a lot of those things are underground, and a lot of us miss those things because we look at it from a foreign eye. There are a number of areas that I, as a foreigner, am not able to or have access to. We don't understand some of the local deal makings that take place in a particular society, so how government shape how we do business in that society. And I think that's going to become an increasing challenge over time. I think also another challenge for us, which I've mentioned, is that despite the fact that we're dealing with increasingly fragile countries, sovereignty is back in the mix, and in a way that I think is very unnerving. By states that don't have any reason to claim sovereignty for themselves, but yet they've claimed it, and claimed it in a very radical way as well. I think also I would resist, but it is a challenge, but I would resist that those who say that the future of liberal peace and democratization is not relevant on the African continent. Certainly it's taken a lot of knocks and it's on the retreat to certain places. Certainly it looks as though those who espouse democracy are only doing it in name, and it's very clear that they understand a lot of the rules of the game and have found different ways to circumvent a lot of these principles. But I would not go as far to say that it's under threat. The fact that a number of states are willing to still engage in this space says a lot, and that itself may lend itself to be an opportunity as well. Finally, my last 2 points in terms of opportunities and what's needed, and I'll link the two of them together. I think in the last decade we have seen a number of new actors, and both on the continent, but global actors, institutions, initiatives that have emerged to support the idea of peace building, and many of them promise a lot of new ways of thinking, new policies, and I don't know that we should rush to throw out, even though I started off my presentation to say that a lot of the norms and principles are under a lot of deep strain, and some of them appear to be derailed. I think these new institutions, these new actors, do provide a window of opportunity, and suggest that not all is lost. I do worry, however, that institutions like ECOWAS, which we saw as the foundation for peace and security on the continent, suffered a serious blow in the last 2 years, first with Ivory Coast, and then with Mali as well. I think what we need to recognise is that regions are not formulated in the way they used to be. So ECOWAS is taking ECOWAS a lot of time to recognise that there are several regions, even within West Africa, in terms of navigating certain processes as well. I think what we need to do differently is bring in a new set of actors, and I recall what our colleague Abudin said, that we tend to look at a very elite cohort of people, but there are other layers in society that are very instrumental. I mean, we can't overstate the role of the community of faith leaders in the Central African Republic, who were instrumental, I think, to limiting some of the violence that we saw against civilians in the Central African Republic. I think we pay lip service to the idea that we should talk to imams and priests and traditional leaders without actually going out to reach out to them and using them in very interesting ways to navigate a lot of these processes as well. I think what we need to do, and one of the things that we need to do, and I don't think it's relevant just to peace building, I think it's relevant to peacekeeping, is that we need to accept that no one institution can go alone. There's a tendency for the UN to think that it's a beauty contest between it and the African Union, and that we need to take more seriously the idea of complementarity. There are certain things that the UN can do better than the African Union. There are certain things that a region can do better than the UN and the European Union. And it's recognising the strengths and weaknesses and the legitimising force of certain entities. I'm less interested in coordination, but more interested in the complementarity of our roles, especially given that we're in a very multipolar moment, and that the institutions we traditionally turn to are not necessarily the first port of contact for dealing with crisis as well. And then I think finally we have to find a way in which we deal with some of the tensions and contradictions inherent in peace building. The idea that accountability remains a challenge, but yet we have to reconcile as well. You ask the government to begin to come in and to put security back in, and yet there's the whole issue about justice and how you make the process more inclusive as well. So I think there's a need to reframe, to pause, to rethink, and to see how certain conflicts are actually rewriting some of the tools that we've held on to for the last 10 to 15 years. And this is a good time, given the work that you're doing, for me to start rethinking these ideas. Thank you.
I'm not even going to try to summarize what you said. I started making copious notes, but this, I think I would actually undermine an excellent presentation by trying to summarize what you're saying. It was so good, and it really went to the core of our discussions at Walton Park. Very, very good. Thank you so much. Cheryl, may I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's my first time at King's College, and nice to be here.
It's only your last time again.
Lots of familiar faces, not just in terms of students, but also old friends from South Africa. I'll be making some general remarks around peace building. Many of them have been made by Prof, but I'll reiterate some of them. And then draw on a study that we did was differed in South Africa, and this was on South Africa's engagement in peace building in Burundi and the DRC, and some of the aspects that came from that particular study, because here was an African country that had the opportunity to do something different, playing a lead role in terms of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building on the continent, and what does it do with that? So, perhaps just to kick off then in the 1990s, we really thought that peace building was going to be the game changer for us, right? In terms of preventing countries from returning to conflict. A decade after that, we saw questions beginning to be raised around the assumptions underpinning peace building, the ideology, and very technical issues around implementation. But now, any paper that you pick up around peace building is literally speaking about the end of peace building. Okay, we moved kind of from questioning its assumptions to we need to rethink it, to literally the last 3 articles I picked up all have the heading, the end of peace building. And I think that this disappointment stems from its seeming inability to have prevented states from relapsing into conflict. If prior to 2013 we all thought conflicts in Africa were on the decrease, we saw that upswing again in 2013. If when the peace building agenda was being introduced, it was to prevent 50% of the states that were relapsing into conflict, now at the recent UN conference they said, well, 90% of conflicts relapse. So we're doing something wrong here, obviously. Many have tried to locate where this problem is. The chair of the Peacebuilding Commission in 2014 noted that efforts to prevent the relapse into conflict remain insufficient and tools are not fully adequate. So it is a problem that can be remedied by doing more of the same, according to this. We must just tinker around with the tools, but the fundamental premises of peace building is okay. That's what I read into that particular statement. Others see the problem as being linked to the motivations, the ideology underpinning it. So it's about external actors promoting liberalism with the prime motivation of controlling individuals, especially their propensity for violence and for fleeing countries. What they've been talking about, the surplus population, I think many of you are familiar with those arguments. So it's a confusion about the nature of peace building and its intended outcome. Is it about stabilization? Is it about state building? Is it about nation building? Is it about social justice? Can it actually eradicate root causes? Is it a set of activities or the aggregate of the set of activities? What is this animal before peace building? You mentioned Mozambique comfort, poster child for peace building. Last year Mozambique relapses into conflict. So for how long must you have stayed conflict free? Because we were working in 5-year time frames, but I think we actually should be working in 20-year frames here. The more substantive critique around peace building is that it doesn't factor in global and local power dynamics, inequality, etc. Peace building is this whole focus on peace building, wanting to rebuild states. And so one of the arguments that came up at Walton Park, well, what are these states that we are actually rebuilding? Aren't we recreating the same states that led to the conflict in the first place? And in many instances, I think that we are. They show the same kind of authoritarian tendencies after about 10 to 15 years. And South Africa is no exception here. Peace-building practitioners also seem to show a lack of understanding for local political systems, how they actually function. We used to refer to this shorthandedly as the lack of context specificity, right? I think that this plays itself out here as well. I think that the conceptualization of the state that they are working with is a very static one. Okay, so it's around the notion of the Liberian state. We build state institutions that are then supposed to deliver certain services. Very static notion. The alternative notion has been that of the state as a regulator of class relations. But is there no alternative conception of the state that we can be thinking of? So I'm not throwing out state building altogether, I am saying that the state is a very necessary component in this exercise. But can we imagine the state a bit differently? Because clearly the African state that we are recreating is not doing what it's supposed to be doing in terms of delivering services. Lauren Hutton has been writing around this recently. I take a quote from her. The very strategies that peace builders have employed to consolidate peace through political and economic liberalization seem to be quite paradoxically increasing the likelihood of renewed violence in several of these states. So what peace building is set up to do, she's saying, is actually encouraging more of the violence. It's playing itself out in different forms, such as riots, protests, etc. But the violence still remains. It's failing them to grapple with the actual challenges of society. I do think that there is validity to all of these arguments, but I think that this is not a problem that emerges simply with peace building. I think this is the point I was trying to make at the World Conference. It's a problem of our conceptualization of the paradigm that we've worked with for a very long time. Okay, this idea has come through from colonialism, mutated a bit through in theories of modernization, structural adjustment programs and theories of good governance, and now in the 1980s and 1990s under these rubrics of human security and peace building. And it's this idea that the African state lacks a number of things, and so the way in which we have to remedy the situation is to replicate these state structures. Once we have those, then everything will be okay. So we go about trying to replicate them in terms of institutions, norms of governance, etc. But we don't get the same result at the end, and we sit back and we wonder why. I think Roland Paris had characterized this as the mission civilisatrice is still at play. That was his famous paper. There's a big caveat, I think, that needs to be introduced here. That the need to build strong states was dominant from the 1960s to about the 1980s, and from the 1980s we had to, get rid of the state. Everything shifted to civil society because the state was bloated, autocratic, militarized, etc. And then we see post-1990s with peace building a re-emphasis on building state institutions and particularly state security structures through security sector reform, etc. And so in this peace building toolbox that you refer to, Comfort, very much the security apparatus right now. You're right, we cannot begin to talk about development in the absence of security. But I think it's finding also the balance between the security sector almost leading the reform process and leaving things like human rights, issues of reconciliation, etc. behind. So that there's way too much emphasis, I think, on stabilization, as you said. I'm not going to go into much of what I talk about in terms of the African contribution here. I think we get the idea that for us as Africans, what we need to put in place are more participatory processes as well. We talk about the need for national dialogues, etc. What is it that we're pushing for? To have a stake in the kinds of programs that are being developed, because we have to live under those conditions. That is what we are echoing all the time. We need to live in dignity, not just to have the skewed emphasis on the security or even on the political sector, but also to look at issues around culture that we often miss out on. Economic, social relations, cultural relations. That, I think, when peace building started, it was that whole gamut of ideas, but we've now reduced everything to simply a focus on the political. Yeah, there's a point here that I want to make, which is one that Mukandawire made around the nature of the rebel groups that have emerged in Africa. He indicated that the reason why we see such violence, okay, such such a dehumanizing way of trying to take control of the state is because these rebel groups have no interest in the rural sector. They are situated there, but they have to actually plunder to get to the state center. Political kingdom is in the urban center, and so they're not bothered about building a constituency in the rural sector. Now, can peacebuilding, in the way in which we have conceptualized it, actually break that cycle so that we don't see rebel group after rebel group re-emerging using the same kinds of tactics? And I don't think so. I don't think peacebuilding will be grappling with those kinds of issues. So I think that any future study around peacebuilding should be taking note of what change is being sought and what change is being stifled, because there's also always its flip side. You are bringing about a certain kind of change, but you're also trying to stifle something else, and we're not too sure about what it is. What are endogenous processes of change that would have emerged? I don't think we can simply isolate peacebuilding. I think we must look at both peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding, and rethink all three, not just the one. Peacebuilding, we tend to concentrate on the external actors, but it is not only an externally driven process. I think feminist studies are more tuned to looking at the local. So they have looked at what civic organizations and women's groups, etc. have done, but a lot of that work is not filtering up into larger peacebuilding work. There remains that disconnect between what is happening at the national level and what is happening at the local level, and we need to be making that reconnect more. Comfort, you've already spoken about local ownership and what that tends to mean. I think, yes, you're right. It is about wanting to reassert our sovereignty, but we haven't looked through what does this local ownership actually mean. So it's been predominantly about elites taking on board programs designed somewhere else and running with that in the name of local ownership. And I don't think that is quite what we mean by local ownership. So we can't be, I guess the argument I'm trying to make here is for us to take more responsibility in relation to what is happening in our societies. It's very easy to critique, but we are often guilty of the same kinds of practices as well. Just in terms of South African engagement then, one of the key questions has been, what are the Africans doing differently? What is new and transformational about their work? When you look at South Africa's engagement, it's actually frightening how little it is. Full very out here. By the rhetoric, there was nothing substantively different in what South Africa did. So it is important to pay closer attention to South Africa's conflict management approach. One, because it was called upon to manage so many conflicts on the continent. Two, because it labeled itself as projecting the African voice, as being the bridge builder. And three, because it seeks to create a different relationship from that which existed before between international community and the local. Okay, trying to transform those relations. And it says that it is demand-driven, it is practicing principles of equality, etc. So does it do anything different? Here, I mean, I wouldn't write it off as saying completely no. I think if we look at what South Africa did in terms of peacemaking, okay, if we look at the Arusha agreement and we look at the DRC's all-inclusive agreement, they're very substantive, comprehensive agreements, and not simply calling for countries to democratize and include, but to go deeper, to try and understand what are those root causes. It was very interesting for me to go and reread the Arusha document and then to discern how they were actually having this instrumentalist view of ethnicity, right? So it was not as if ethnic groups were entrenched in Burundi, and therefore we needed to find some kind of political agreement. They were saying that ethnicity was being used to mobilize to get access to resources, so very instrumentalist. Here, the solution that they come up with is very much the same of power sharing, etc. So you have a different kind of analysis, but at the time unable to think outside of that box, I think. I mean, for me, I'm still stuck now, and Janine, I would like you to pick up on this because I think you know it well. If the agreement in Burundi is that 40% of the seats are to be held for Tutsis, who are 15% of the population, 50% of the army, for how long is that agreement going to hold? Okay? It might have been very necessary to get them to the next step, but is that something that is necessarily going to, be that society would want to keep for a very long time? I think now looking back at Burundi is at the crossroads as we move to elections. South Africa helped it in terms of peacemaking and even deploying those 701 peacekeeping forces. I don't think that peace agreement would have held if it was not for South Africa deploying when nobody else wanted to deploy. And I think we need to give South Africa that. But South Africa left in 2009, and it really didn't do much afterwards, right? It was really just hit and run, or what I call hit and run tactics afterwards. Training diplomats, engaged in some kind of DDR, trying to build a civil service, really very minimal at that. What was interesting is that the court, I don't know if anyone here worked for a court. I think there was somebody at the conference who was for court, yeah? So South Africa uses an NGO basically in Burundi to continue its work. And I think that they did some great work. But it does not do the same for the DRC, right? The DRC government tends to stay there. In terms of what it actually did, it worked on a framework for SSR, but it had one person stationed in the police, whereas the British had about 50 people. So just in terms of its resource input, they're minimal. It could not make a substantive impact, even if it wanted to. So with very minimal reserves, South Africa was trying to do a whole lot of things and actually impacted on nothing and moved away. Now, because Janine is here, and I know that Janine started some work with the police, right, with community policing. It was interesting to go back to the police, and they actually remember IDASA for coming in, for starting the programs, and then they said, you left. And that is South Africa's approach. We go in, we do things, and then we leave, and the rest of the international community comes in, and they actually take kudos and credit for that. This tension, Devin noted at Wilton Park, of sovereignty and peace building. On the one hand, we want external actors to have a light footprint, she indicated, but if there is this light footprint, how do you control what happens? Do we want to control what happens? This is what Devin was trying to say. She felt, she had just come back from Burundi, and she felt that given the kinds of relations going up into May now, Burundi was really sliding back in terms of authoritarian practices, human rights abuses, etc. How much intervention should there be, and how much should we step back? I'm not sure how to deal with that question. There is a tension I see there between the need for sovereignty and then how do you put checks and balances and who's supposed to be doing that. Just the interesting point I would want to note in terms of the DRC is the Force Intervention Brigade that is there now. They seem to do pretty well in terms of neutralizing, this is their language, the M23. But now, with the FDLR, there's been a complete hesitation to go after the FDLR because now we see the schisms between different countries coming to the fore as well. So South Africa was quite ready to go in again and deal with the FDLR in terms of the way they deal with it. But Tanzania said, hold on, no, I don't think we want to go in. And Malawi didn't also know what to do. So up until now, there has been no kind of push to go the step further, even though the agreement was for 6 months, I think. For me, I think that the way in which they are dealing with this, I'm going to quote myself here, is like wiping the mold away without dealing with the damp that is causing the mold to flow. Yeah, we're papering over things here. I don't think that this is the way in which we're going to actually resolve issues. It's a temporary way to stabilize the situation, but they're not thinking through this properly as well. And that would be the emphasis still very much in terms of stabilization, I would imagine. Let me conclude by some of what I think my take-home points are. I think peacebuilding has a very mixed record. South Africa's engagement in peacebuilding itself, much more mixed. The assumption has been that if we put mechanisms and institutions in place, things will work, but these institutions are themselves subverted. When you walk into those government departments in the DRC, they're so ramshackle, so dilapidated, you know that power is not located there. You know that those are not decision-making spaces. Decisions are made somewhere else. I think that there are many different conflicts happening simultaneously in these countries. Which conflict is peacebuilding actually trying to address? Is it addressing all of them simultaneously? Is it focused on one national conflict? Usually. How do we begin to upscale work that is being carried out by local groups? And I don't think this is a question about money. It's a question about knowledge, knowing what is taking place, what works, what doesn't work, and then allowing those kinds of programs space. I think that despite all the DDR and SSR programs, we have not succeeded in taking guns out of circulation, and we have not succeeded in professionalizing many of the armed forces. And we certainly have not succeeded in eradicating violence. Much of that violence gets displaced into communities and into the home, because there's no coincidence why sexual-based violence rises at the same time as we have close conflict environment. Peacebuilding has human security, human dignity, not simply about the right to choose leaders and put in place laws and institutions, but in regaining that which essentially makes us human. The knowledge that our humanity is dependent on giving others humanity. And I think that we have, for a long time, been robbed of that. And hence, this kind of divest violence that we are seeing. We need to change that lived reality for peacebuilding.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation. I want to ask Funmi that you going directly so that we still have a bit of time for discussion also, please.
Okay, thanks. I think my colleagues have done a fantastic job of, not just laying the ground, but bringing back quite a number of the issues that were discussed at the Voting Park meeting. And I want to try to tackle this a little bit. In any case, I have to reflect a lot on what happened in Voting Park, if only to begin to help construct some of the ideas of the panel. Since Voting Park itself was meant to be one of our consultations. And so there's a lot for me to chew on, and I want to spend the next 10 or so minutes trying to give a sense of
the sort of issues that have come up for me, and what, how one might, what sort of questions and what, and the ways in which we might begin to try to tackle them. And then not unrelated to the issues you have both put on the table. One, there's no question. The reason why this advisory group of experts was set up was precisely because even the UN itself had to acknowledge that we have to rethink. We have to really rethink the whole peace-building architecture, the whole peace-building agenda. If relapse, which was at the heart of, at the heart of the creation, was at the heart of the reasoning behind the peace-building architecture, remains an issue, then what is the success factor? It's not only an issue, it continues to rise. But the factors of that rise are things that we have to investigate carefully. If 10 years ago the Peacebuilding Commission was set up precisely because, as the Secretary General said at the time, there's a gaping hole in the UN system when it comes to trying to deal with countries that are emerging from conflict. And 10 years later, we don't seem to have gotten it. Can we return to the vision that underpinned the creation of that architecture in the first instance and see what is it that has gone awry in trying to be faithful to that vision? And how can we begin to think it better? Unfortunately, the current environment is not as easy as it was. It's not been static. It's changed tremendously. The number of things that remain the same, and this whole issue of change and continuity was at the heart of our conversation in Wilton Park. So it leads me to take on board all the points that have been mentioned by Comfort and Cheryl, but to say, really, what is it about now? That was then, and we want to be faithful to that vision that underpinned the establishment of the Commission then. What is it about now that might make it difficult for us to return to delivering, to at least to begin to deliver that vision? I think there's something in the current terrain, and of course, as you point out, Comfort, there are new actors in that terrain. But I think the nature of that terrain is what we need to interrogate. We are, of course, we have relapse, but when you look at the space in which we are applying those old structures, the space has shrunk significantly. Central African Republic and, if you like, what can you say is Mali might be a small evidence of trying to engage that terrain. But look at the whole of Libya. Look at the whole of the Sahel. Look at the places we're not policing. Look at Somalia and Kenya. When I talk about the whole of Sahel, I'm talking about the corridors from Mali to northeastern Nigeria, where we cannot, and I agree, the norms and the approaches are under serious strain, where we cannot even typically deploy in the way that we would to those places. Boko Haram, Shabab, and Co will make mincemeat out of Africa. All right? And therefore, your AMISOM is about the closest to dealing with that. And as you heard in Wilton Park, one of our analysts was constrained, had to begin to look at empirical evidence in the way the African Union has been responding to that place and try to suggest that perhaps the AU has used stabilization as peace building. Okay? But that in itself is a tall order. If what we're trying to do was to create an environment after the guns had fallen silent, to try and build a new future for that society. I think we have a big challenge on our hands. We have a big challenge on our hands. And a big part of that challenge, which poses great difficulty for the current approaches, Comfort, is what I was referring to as the transnational nature of this new terrain. That the real life that many Africans lead, that they led and still lead, has caught up with our systems. They led it before the margins of the state, moved in and out of borders, tried to cope in different ways with climatic conditions, tried to be in search of food, and did that, and there were no major we didn't have any major crisis. But now, those who occupy the space outside of the state understand that it is lucrative to follow the movements of people across borders in the Sahel. So the same Tuareg, and let's not just talk about Azawad, let's talk about the Tuaregs and how they have traditionally moved across the Sahel. Means that if you limited your operation into within Mali and you were dealing with Mali as a state, you have not dealt with the challenge, with the transnational challenge, where if you follow people's movements in the way they really move, all the legality and illegality, crime and conflict follows them. So if you are simply keeping peace, even robustly within one country, you will not deal with the problem. And that's the challenge that we face, as I indicated, as sovereignty-bound actors, that we can't truly act transnationally. Even if we acted regionally, it does not deal with the problem, because we're still acting regionally as states. I think that that's one of the biggest challenges that I think that terrain poses for us. And I think it's a very difficult problem. In leadership terms, we could even say it's a wicked problem, but it poses it's a major opportunity for us to begin to rethink our approaches. And so, how do we understand peace building, or the concept of peace, is something we have to confront, and that's part of what we're discussing. Are we therefore saying that we want to limit ourselves only to what we define tightly as post-conflict terrains? What is post-conflict? Can we even really say what is post-conflict in the places that we're dealing with at the moment? We have to confront that reality. If we have to define it as tightly as before, it means that we know that for sure as an international community we will limit ourselves to only the tiny places where we've been operating. Cote d'Ivoire will look very nice. In the scheme of things, Liberia will look very nice because they're not as dangerous, if you like. And so we'll find things closest to them and we'll confine ourselves as an international community just to those places. But that would be a shame for United Nations that was created, for the maintenance of international peace and security, if you like. So it's an opportunity because we're compelled to rethink. We're compelled to change, to rethink how we do business. Okay? So those approaches by the international community, in which actually the UN Peacebuilding Commission, which initially you thought would deal with pre-armed conflict situation, ended up confining itself to post-conflict situations, have been challenged very seriously. One of the things we therefore said in Voting Back was about the notion of taking peace building as something that deals with the full cycle of conflict. As the African continent understands, and even within the UN peace building framework itself, that element that tries to help societal cohesion, that element that tries to help deal with putting all of those missing gaps together in a country, is not as expensive as the stabilization operations that we're talking about. The Peace Building Fund probably has had a budget of $100 million per year, which is tiny. The average, 15,000 peacekeeping operation will be between $800,000 and $1 billion per year. And I think if we thought pre-conflict and we engage peace building as a matter of course across the conflict cycle, we will go to countries earlier, we'll try to strengthen things, and it will cost us far less. And there are a few African countries who could spend $200 million and not even feel it. Well, let's not go to Nigeria and what it has lost. What they're still looking for, about $20 billion that went missing in the past year. So that is small change as Nigerians would have, But this is the issue. The power dynamics that exist between, so we're seeing South Africa, in its own small piece trying to do creative things, and it does sometimes, but in other ways it does exactly what the United Nations does. The African Union does exactly what the United Nations does. So what is the added value? Are they going to compete in those spaces doing the same things? If we're going to think about the whole conflict cycle, we have to be thinking about the African Union and REX engaging earlier. And that's your point of complementarity. without that kind of complementarity, because we know the UN is extremely complex, this means that I'm now offering my own views and not necessarily the views of the advisory group. But the fact is that the rules that govern the Peacebuilding Commission have already been written. And I very much doubt that the UN will go back to the drawing board anytime soon. So even so, if you talk about the complexity of the politics of member states, the self-interest, enlightened self-interest of African countries ought to be able to prevail to allow them to go to places long before those places are torn apart and move beyond their capacity to deal with, the ramifications from it. And that's what we will start thinking about and thinking differently about. Okay, so of course we need to think about what it means for the power dynamics, even between the African Union, not just between the UN and the AU, but between the African Union and the widespread nature of difficult conflict that we don't even know how to deal with. What lies at the root of it? That's the essence of peace building, to try to go back to deal with the issues that led to this kind of conflict in the first instance. And that's what we've skirted around and danced around as the international community, and that's why we see continued relapses or new improved cases of conflict, and affliction, if you like. And that takes me to your state question. The state question is central. All actors collectively have one thing in common. They agree there's a problem with the African state. Okay? That's where it starts, and that's where it stops. For the outsider, liberal peace is very attractive, because you're thinking it is the African state. Look at how the state is and how it does not provide. Look at how weak it is, how fragile it is. It doesn't provide for the whole of society. There's no authority. Let us give you a good state, a good formula for a state. And I think that is where liberal peace falls on its head. And comfort, I agree with you, because it's not that I'm trying to throw the baby away with the bathwater. But I want to suggest that until liberal peace and the point at which it enters is rethought, we're not going to make that much headway. The nature of the African state, we stopped thinking and talking about it, I think, now in the 80s, isn't it? But of course, I accept that Shivji, in fact, Peter Eke's brilliant piece, and you can also see what Claude Ake was alluding to. We stopped right there. Then we took peace and conflict as though they were separate things from these issues. And then suddenly state building became the only formula for peace building. What is tragically wrong with that state is that, unlike the Westphalian state we're talking about, those states did not emerge from within African societies as such. So the notion that a state was created as an expression of the will of a people is not what has happened here. Let me separate state from regime, because sometimes we tend to conflate them, and we'll talk about this a little bit. There's that state. Then you have, what is it that represents it? Is the institutions of the state, the institutions that are designed to do for people what, we submit our personal sovereignty to the center. And the center, in a sense, in exchange, we do certain things, but the protection, the justice systems, everything you give to us, and leadership succession has to go hand in hand with that. But instead, in our own situation, we didn't quite submit it, because we did not have that conversation that says, these are the terms. Of course, South Africa is different. You had your own struggles and then started having the conversations. Okay, so the institutions that were handed down to African people did not really look like what, ought to be an expression of that society. You give me courts where I don't even speak English, somebody translates for me. Yeah, you put your, wig and gown on. I don't know what that represents anyway. So, judicial structures, military institutions with people who fought in Burma and all different places, frontier forces for the colonial masters. You put them together and say you are protecting the people. There is no relationship. So we haven't reported those things at all. And an executive system that more or less replicates this overall authoritarian thing, but in name only, we say we have those institutions. Of course, that is at the heart of conflict, because people and those structures do not relate. You've designed them not for these people. So the starting point is to have a conversation to say, there is conflict at last, maybe it's an opportunity to rebuild. On what basis are we going to live together and rebuild? Please, let's separate these institutions from the managers of the institutions. Because what has happened all along is that the managers of the institutions took over from another set of managers. And they managed it now in their own interest, not in the interest of the old managers. If we went to war on that basis, the starting point ought not to be that you are saying to us your state has failed. We know it's failed. It's never worked in the first instance. The starting point shouldn't be that you tell us, let us help you rebuild your state. Your military looks exactly like ours, which is what you gave to us, and is doing exactly what it did before. The judicial system looks exactly the same. All right, there's no transformation in that. And then you need a market democracy. That's what you need. Your economy has to look like this. When we never even had a chance to debate it.
Yeah.
That is the real tragedy with liberal peace building. So it isn't that liberal peace building doesn't work where societies are ready for it and they've debated it. But for these African states that we're talking about, the real canker is the state and the nature of the state, and that is the first point. And my charge, if I had a chance, if my voice means anything, would be to say it's not about developmental states or liberal peace building and what it might be inherently wrong with them. It's about process. It's about facilitating a process where our duty as an international community is to keep the gates for these people to have a conversation amongst themselves. On what basis shall we live together? Don't tell us go to elections in 6 months on the basis of the same institutions that didn't work. Can we try talking? And don't tell us, in Liberia we were told by even some of our own colleagues here in the UK who said, how long is Amos Sawyer going to facilitate a national dialogue on security? It's taking time. And I had to say, as long as it takes. But we put checklists and time frames, and we need everything in place because we need to get out. And so the key message for me from Wilton Park was this. Nation building, which one of our colleagues was talking about, is not the same as state building. It's not. And it is not the job of externals. But I equate that, I see the vehicle for nation building as leadership. That is what my primary interest in leadership is. And it was Brahimi who said that it is arrogance to say the least. He was saying this in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq, that it is arrogance to say the least, that as an external you're going somewhere to go and do nation building. It is that conversation between leaders and the led about their common situation, their mutual condition, that nation building is about. And that's the first entry point if you want to prevent relapse, to my mind. And that's not anything that we do as the international community. Our job as an international community is help them hold the space so that they don't kill each other whilst their nations having nation building conversations. And that for me is the medicine for relapse. And I want to conclude on a note where I'm not quite saying this pessimistically. I think the biggest challenge, and that's where the opportunity lies, is whether the powers that be are ready to transform their own approaches to doing business. Because this transnational challenge I talked about earlier requires a transnational approach, and it means that actually, and I agree, the kind of actors that emerge will look different. They will look different. It doesn't mean now South Africa will not be different, but perhaps what South Africa does begins to look different. Because those who are interested in holding this space should be the one, so that the custodians of that process are the international community, the United Nations and its ideals will help guard that space. I think we have to go to the drawing board. Otherwise, we need to understand that ISIS will continue, Shabab will continue, Boko Haram will continue, because they are a new expression of the discontent with the nature of the African state, or the nature of their own states, and the approaches of the international community. They are a new expression of it. One of our guest speakers the other day, 2 days ago, described this as a franchise. Everyone is responding to local conditions, but they have franchised the method. In fact, did he not refer to it as McDonald's? That ISIS and Co are like McDonald's. They borrow methodology and so on, but each one is responding to its unique local conditions, which means the exchange of influence that needs to happen in local places where leaders and their people are having a conversation about their mutual situation is not going on. And so now that conversation is going on violently. I don't want to be pessimistic, but what I'm trying to say is we need a paradigm shift of sort. It's not so much that we need some new normative frameworks and so on, but a paradigm shift is needed. And the world at this moment cannot afford to wait one moment longer without rethinking this. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I'll piggyback on something.
Okay. Okay.
Very briefly, yeah, because it's not simply that they want us to recreate states to control our population. Because that is what it's about. It's about control. But it's also because these state structures are the only ones that they also know how to communicate with. So Prime Minister must be to your minister, etc. That's the one point. The second point is on the regional initiative. I think we have been speaking through and even forming regional initiatives for quite a long time, seeing conflicts in terms of a regional security complex. But there again too, our interlocutors are states.
Absolutely.
And we need to get below that.
Absolutely.
Right. Alex, we don't have very much time. What did you say? When do you want us to?
No, really to get to
Can we go to around 42?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We just leave the class in time for another class.
So let's open it up then immediately. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, if you can keep it short, please, and just identify yourself. It makes it easier perhaps with the visitors. So it's the gentleman at the back. I'm going to take one round and then we'll have another round. So the first hands I see the gentleman at the back, Stephanie, and young man here, and then I will go to a second round. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to. My question is all the issues being raised with regards to how states or how people should organize themselves. Is it not the problem of the poverty of philosophy? It's called philosophy because we don't ask questions. Even at our universities, we are not allowed to ask questions about how best we should do things. Rather, we are always forced to ask questions about empirical distance. So is it a problem of lack of philosophy that has been even imposed within universities, not allowing people to think outside the existing context and reality based on maybe the post-Cold War hangovers? Thank you.
Is that a general question?
It's a general question
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much to all our discussants. My name is Stephanie Minou. I'm currently an ALC fellow, and my question is directed to Dr. Aero. I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier when you were discussing your views and the things that came up of the conference. You said something about liberal democracy, and you said that even you don't believe that it's that much under threat, even though there are challenges. I'm not sure on what basis you are that optimistic. Personally, I'm not that optimistic. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I don't know what kind of democracy we're actually talking about with regard to the African continent. Is it the kind of democracy whereby we know that leaders are going to become leaders and never will believe that they're never going to leave, you know. I mean, I'm saying this because if you take, for instance, a country like Cameroon, you know, is that democracy, you know, whereby you have leaders who have been there for like more than 30 years? Or if I refer to one conversation that we had yesterday with the former governor of Ekiti State, who said that when he lost elections, he actually left because he had received threats, you know, otherwise there was going to be blood. Is that the kind of democracy we're talking about? Because in my opinion, just because, you know, it's not that visible, I don't think, I mean, unless you're really able to tell me, you know, what it is that makes you that optimistic, you know, or are we gonna have, you know, are we looking at another case like Burkina Faso, whereby there's no conversation between leaders and followers, and then one day followers just get frustrated, and then we see the type of crisis that we see all the time on our continent. So if you could just perhaps tell me what it is that, you know, that makes you that optimistic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward, fellow at program. My question is on this emerging, what I would call, quote unquote, diplomacy on sustaining conflict among leaders, whereby, for example, South Sudan, Salva Kiir exchanges a lot of support to stay in power, and that situation, despite the situation happening with people like Museveni, Uhuru Kenyatta, and Paul Kagame, who they feel like they have to relate with him. And ideally, the statement he says is, if this was to happen in your country, would you allow me to come and to overthrow you? And how does that, especially now, link with what Dr. Funmi says, conversations that are taking place in society, looking at the ability of the power holders to capture that conversation and hold it to their, or direct it to their best interests, and not the interests of the population?
Well, it's 3 questions. Let's respond to those. It's the question about, you know, do we have the time and inclination to think? Comfort you on being too optimistic. And then something that came up at Walking was the whole regional conversation around, I don't know whether you would be able to respond to that, around South Sudan and the leaders of the, especially the IGAD countries, and the interaction with Salva Kiir. It might be useful if you could perhaps.
I'll pick up on the poverty of philosophy question. I don't think that there's a lack of ideas in Africa. I think we've always had a vision, multiple visions, like urban visions. We were speaking again at Bolton Park of how the 1970s and early 80s, it was a space in Africa for ideas to flourish. Even though we came up with programs that didn't work as well as we had expected, for example, in Tanzania we had villagization, Uhuru, etc. There was an experimentation out there. Okay, I think that when you go around and you listen to people know that things are not working well. They have alternative visions. The question is, whose ideas are able to get to which platforms taken on board where? Okay, how is that scaffolding taking place? I think we also need to look at the youth for new ideas, because some of us are getting older and keep talking about the state when there are all sorts of other things that need to be spoken about. So, yeah, it's about whose ideas get taken on board, whose ideas are allowed to be expressed, more than there being a poverty of ideas.
I don't think I want to add anything like this.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to ask Edward to but I get you to explain what your precise question is.
My question is, how will the society approach these conversations that Funmi says, nation building, especially when you have power holders who are so much forming, using the states to form the more like the quote unquote diplomacy of conflict to sustain themselves into power and entrenching their positions further. Looking at the case of South Sudan, whereby it's getting a lot of comradeship from the regional leaders.
Okay, let me just deal with that I dare to be optimistic. My question is the question. This question was posed to Devon as well in Milton Park, if you remember, a colleague of ours, and her response is exactly my response. Is liberal democracy itself the problem? Would be my response back to you to answer you. I also think that we have to separate those who challenge liberal democracy versus those who seek it and desire it, and that's where you and I don't believe that the notions of human rights and the right to choose my leader is an alien concept to anybody on the continent. I don't believe that it's something fundamentally foreign with the idea of my right to vote, but my right to express my expression against a particular leader. Those of us who are Nigerian in the room will conclude that while security is a real issue right now in Nigeria, there are question marks in the manner and the way in which our right to vote on the day that we thought was supposed to be the vote is taken away from us. That, whether that's liberal democracy or not, I don't know, but my right as a citizen to call my government into question, no matter in which space I belong to. So I don't think there's nothing wrong with the idea of liberal democracy. However, I think that yes, a number of these democracy experiments that we started to initiate in the 1990s are under severe threat. I also think that those who champion democracy outside, particularly in the P5, that not all the P5 countries are democrats themselves and don't care much for democracy as well. They use it as a code word for stabilization as well. I think that's where it's been misused and abused. So you can challenge the practice, but I would never challenge the ideas or the ideals of democracy, because we are all espousing some form of right to decide who governs us and how we are governed as well. I would say that you're right that most of the leaders nowadays are outsmarting most of us and know the norms very well and know the rules of the game very well and usurp a lot of these norms particularly well. I would say that right across some of areas on the continent that authoritarianism is drifting back in certain spaces. I can talk about Ethiopia, and I can even talk about the Kenyan response. When Kenya has been criticized about its attempt to initiate a security bill, its response is, do you want us to be like the Ethiopians, a police state, or do you want us to deal with a real national security problem? This is the debate that's taking place in Kenya. So what do we want Kenya, how do we want Kenya to respond? When you're asking Kenya to put in place, democratic practices, it rightfully has to ask, well, how do I deal with this threat on my border with Somalia? We may take issue with the way Kenya is responding, but I think it's a real life question to ask the state how it can protect its citizens at the same time. So I wouldn't challenge the fundamentals of liberal democracy. I would challenge the way in which some of our leaders are usurping some of these important principles. As for what is happening with South Sudan, I actually think that it's an interesting moment, because what we're asking IGAD to do is almost a cultural leap of faith for IGAD. Because these very countries themselves not only delivered South Sudan, but for them, I think also we have to recognize that what has been achieved in the last 12 months, or what hasn't been achieved in the last 12 months, is a real benefit balancing act. On the 15th of December, the government could have collapsed. And in a sense, we have to at least acknowledge Uganda stopped that collapse from Juba. And I think it's very difficult to accept that, but we have to accept it. That's what was preventing it. We also have to acknowledge that IGAD, despite all its faults, has prevented a proxy war from emerging between Ugandans and Sudan in South Sudan. I think we also have to acknowledge that despite all the attempts and the failure to put in place and hold in place a peace agreement in South Sudan, that to a certain extent IGAD has managed to contain the crisis, but it hasn't managed to go to the next level. And IGAD is being asked today to hold a conversation not just in Addis with the heads of states, and some of those heads of states are not even turning up. Riyak and Salva are not even turning up for the heads of states meeting. What we want IGAD to do is a real paradigm shift. I don't know how you can ask, as essentially an intergovernmental process, to craft a process that essentially will result in probably kicking out one of its own people. It's a difficult task. And so you might need somebody else to be part of that
if I can add to
conversation.
That, there will always be limitations in that process. Because the very agreement that led to the creation of the state of South Sudan did not embed with it any potential for nation building as such, of leaders and people exchanging. It built a peace around individuals, just like the rest of the regimes around.
They did something even more than that.
Yes.
The idea that I liberated you and therefore I decide your fate, that's a logic.
Absolutely.
And all these are all holds them all in common, they're all liberators.
Absolutely. And they all went in to want to build states, classically, liberally, not to try to help leaders and the people forge a common destiny. So this new conflict was not about fundamental debates within Southern Sudanese society about the future. It was about the future of individuals. Yes,
and you can't. The idea that, what we've gotten IGAD to do so far is quite significant. Because of all the regional entities, it was the one that, apart from maybe Somalia, and I don't know whether maybe IGAD has reached its limits, and maybe we have to look for other instruments and mechanisms to help it out, to support it out, and to get to that conversations that you're talking about. But I think we have reached the limits of what IGAD can do. I think what worries me more today is that those who support IGAD do not recognize the cost of regionalizing the response to these crises. That we need to begin to recognize that there is a cost in regional solutions, and that we shouldn't subscribe to regional solutions as the solution to a crisis. Because I think we've now come to the end of this chapter, and we now need to start rethinking how we're going to take South Sudan to the level that you're asking for, and which Funmi is begin to articulate. I don't see that now with the current scenarios on the ground of South Sudan.
And the gentleman here, sorry for pointing with the one shirt. So did you have your hand up, sir?
Yes, I
So those three now, and then hopefully if we keep it brief, we can have one last quick round. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Modu Sonyango, a fellow at the African Leadership Center. Now my question goes to Dr. Funmi. The three speakers brought out lack of local ownership, and of course the lamentation with regard to external initiation. And Dr. Funmi has told us, for example, that the Commission, the UN Commission, its rules are already written. My question is, how do you plan to navigate this particular issues of lack of local ownership, external initiation, and also of course the interests that are embedded within it in your job as an advisor to the youth?
Thank you so much. My name is Kozdamela. I'm also a fellow at the African Leadership Center. I have two questions. The first one is, any of you can respond to that. The place of private sector in two ways. The first one is in terms of from the economical point of view. Those people are usually benefit more when there is peace, but I haven't seen them taking part in peace building process in Africa. So, what is their role in peace building? And then from the other issue, private security, the issue of new thinking, new liberal thinking, considering like security as a commodity where even the state is one of a good customer. So it's not the responsibility of the state. So do you really think that private security, it could be company or any sort have a place in peace building? And then the second issue is specifically goes to Dr. Comfort with the issue of use. I believe there is a problem in terms of engaging the youth with decision making or anything. You were saying that the focus is more on state building than society and state relationship. And then there is an assertion in a way that society see youth as a threat, not the other way around. So what's the role of youth in peace building when you see like ISIS, Al-Shabaab, name it, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Burkina Faso? It's the youth who are agents of those violent activities.
Okay, if it's to be brief, then I just make a point. Peace building is state building. If the problem we face is the lack of governance. So if, of course, we reconstruct an order that has led to the catastrophe, this has nothing to do with state building. It's not state building, no matter how often one calls it state building. Anyway, my main point I want to make is, why do we always wait until the child is in the well? You know, I can see that now Cameroon was mentioned. Cameroon has no state. There was a state until about 1982, something like this, and then it was transformed into a monarchy, and an early modern monarchy, even if it's a sophisticated one. No, everything that separates Yaoundé from a complete being overrun by armed groups in the north is a tiny group of 4,500 Brigade d'Intervention Rapide. The army the Cameroon has is useless. This is everything that protects this state from suddenly collapsing. This is a country which is on very, very thin ice, and under this thin ice is a lot of cold water. And nobody is going to survive if this small layer of forces breaks. So is this not the moment to go to Paul Biya, who's probably in Geneva, and ask him, what do you think, Paul, should we start state building in Cameroon now? You will have a nice legacy afterwards, get the Motivering Prize. And we have prevented this country from collapsing into exactly this situation where then we come up and try to reconstruct Paul Biya's monarchy afterwards. Isn't this now the time to go there and do state building now?
Yes, sorry, Moses, it's a powerful question because in fact, the weight of expectation in that question is huge. But you're right. The terms of reference of this advisory group, those terms have been written, and we're required to follow them. And part of those terms is that we're working with an existing, framework. We're not going to go back to redesign the Peacebuilding Commission's purpose, for example. So this notion of post-conflict, a whole range of things cannot easily be dealt with, but I don't think it's insurmountable. That's why I raised the issue of what do you define as post-conflict earlier. So I think there's room to maneuver there. But the issue of local ownership is not the principle itself that is the problem. It is the cooptation or usurpation of it by unscrupulous state and non-state actors who claim, oh, we're doing a whole lot of local ownership. In fact, when we started out, discussing as local ownership in SSR, very rapidly became national ownership. And people will challenge you, but we have spoken to the leaders. It does not matter how illegitimate those leaders are in the eyes of the people. As far as the international community is concerned, sometimes there's national ownership. So if Paul Biya has been spoken to and he likes something, that is local ownership. Okay, it doesn't matter that the rest of the Cameroonians don't want it like that. I think that's a challenge, and it's not a challenge that is for the UN only, it's also a challenge for the African institutions we're talking about. What I think there's a lot of room to do is to create an environment for robust conversation between a whole range of actors within the United Nations system and the constituencies outside the United Nations system. Because one thing this group acknowledges immediately from the start is that peace building is not the business of the United Nations alone. There are a whole range of actors that bear responsibility for peace building. And without thinking about their role and what they do, we would have missed the point. But ultimately as well, all that is left to us is to write, is to be faithful to what we have found in this report and to report accordingly. After our draft report is out, the politicking around it, to get it amongst member states, because we report to the General Assembly and Security Council, it's not even to the Secretary General. The process of discussing politically what it means and what they do is a difficult one. I mean, it's a complex one. But for us, I don't think the task is that difficult if we're faithful to what we said we'll do. And that is to be as robust as possible, to leave member states with very little choice. If they can't even implement what is there, they ought to be able to explain why they could not implement it. Ultimately, it's their decisions to implement or not implement. But to put them in a position where something is so glaring that they would have to explain to various constituencies why it wasn't done is perhaps the best that we can hope to achieve. I don't know whether that answers the question. Thank you.
In the South African case, I think that the private sector has played quite a major role in terms of peace building in Southern Africa in particular. If the South African government has this hit and run approach, the private sector actually goes in and stays. I was quite amazed in the DRC, for example. There was a supermarket that they set up, and I immediately thought this was going to be another one of the ShopRite stores where they get accused of racism and all of this again. But the DRC government, I think, negotiated with this particular store. I can't remember the name of the supermarket. So that they had to get the produce from the DRC and they had to employ people from the DRC as well. And that seemed to be working well in that context. So it's also, yes, the private sector has a role to play, but governments have to negotiate and regulate that private sector. The same with the private security. The private security is recognized as an actor in the security sector. So when you have your security sector reform conversations in the post-conflict phase, they should be part of that conversation. When you're discussing effectiveness, efficiency, legitimacy, etc., they should be part of that conversation. In many cases, they form the bulk of the security sector in terms of numbers. Right? I know in South Africa we have more private security guards than we have policemen, for example. And let me just pick up a bit on the state building issue, because you're right. I mean, what they're putting up there is shouts, right? And they're calling it state building, which is not really state building. And that's why we're saying we need a different kind of conversation around the states that are being built here. Now, with the case of Bian and the 4,000,
Well, 4,500.
4,500 keeping him from state collapse. Again, if we take the DRC, when government troops started running away because they had no interest, no vested interest in keeping the system alive, the whole system collapses, and that is going to be the case here as well. Whether you can get him to see that now, because he has been systematically getting rid of those institutions and state structures, but he's going to have no interest in actually rebuilding them. We'll have to take somebody else to come in and do that.
It's hard to
We dared to write a report on life after Paul Beer, and then we were arrested, so you'll understand how I can argue quite on the subject. But your point is taken very well. I mean, there is no shortage of early warning, and you can almost write the script of what's going to happen. But you also have to ask yourself why we don't react, and and again, given the organisation I work for, nobody can say you weren't warned about what could potentially go wrong in Cameroon. Those that need to know it, but they choose and decide when not to act as well. So that would be my response. And I do think, given what Funmi is doing, it's quite sobering actually. When I think about the information that's out there, and then the lack of response to things that are pretty obvious as well. And the same with the youth. I think, if I have the statistics on my hand, you just need to look at the statistics to know that, anybody in this business cannot do their business without factoring in the youth. The fact, as you said, that they become cannon fodder for ISIS and Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, there lies your answer. If we can't get some of the activities right, we give lip service to things like job creation, economic recovery, blah blah blah, but yet you still have a large sway of society that is left out of the process. Most of those who are recruited into a lot of these groups are children, are young people, and it's quite amazing how many of them are lingering on the streets. This remains the weakest link in the process. But yeah, it's a depressing note to end on, but it is the reality that the future is here with us, and we haven't quite reconciled the conversation with trying to elite bargain with dealing with these conversations that Funmi's talked about that are essential to getting it right in the future. And I think your work, without telling you, is going to be a tough one to how to rethink this issue.
Okay. One more question, the lady there at the back, and then unfortunately we'll have to stop.
Yes, well, these would be really easy questions. I'm Daniela Fetiga UNC, and I'm a master's student in theology and politics. And I just wanted to ask, in terms of what Dr. Funmi said about these conglomerates of power, actually what they need to do is look at facilitating the process to bring about that paradigm shift that you were talking about. I was just wondering that some of the things that are factored in during peace building, have any of you seen any links between peace building and the healthcare initiatives that emerge after there's been a conflict? And then secondly, what you've noticed what happened with the Arab Springs and the role that information technology played. Is that an impact on, does it have any impact on peace building?
Thanks. I'm sure I'll need support for this, especially in that response to the Arab Spring. But I think peace building and healthcare, this is amazing. Galton, when he first started writing about peace building in the late 60s, actually as early as 64 really, and then it advanced rapidly from about 69. If you go to his early work, you will see a direct link between peace and health, isn't it? I think there's a personal historical reason for him, because as he was living through things, his father told the medical doctor, he was able to liken that. So imagine part of the internal conversation we're having, trying to figure out all of these approaches. In New York the other time, when we went back to Galton and the notion of peace, is therefore a patient is on life support machine. Yeah, a patient is in intensive care. You take them out of the intensive care unit. What do you do? Huh? Yes, but then what you either say to them, what can we do to support your rehabilitation, your recuperation? Or are you telling them you're on your own? Just now go ahead. I mean, you can look at intensive care unit and what happens after intensive care unit to look at this condition of conflict and peace. And yet in real life, that is not what we do, actually. And so in real life, we're not saying how can you be supported, rehabilitated. It's a long-term process. You cannot put a timeline on it. In real life, it's about what is my interest. My interest in you is over, because I just don't want you to die, because you will create problems for me if you die. There are implications for me. Now that you're alive, goodbye. The politics of continuing to look after myself is, supersedes everything else. So looking at healthcare systems is usually a tall order when there's so many other emergencies for us to look at. So the way the power brokers, power holders define the state of peace, what is peace and the state of peace for themselves rather for society, I think determines a lot about, around how come health systems are among the last things that get built. And yet there's a lot of emergency support for health. There's a lot of emergency support for education. Post-conflict, I guess keeping the interests of all the gun holders and the power brokers together is far more important than putting those systems in place. Ebola is the aftermath of something like that. I know that I've not answered your question elegantly, but it's my own way of trying to reflect on it.
And Rwanda has an amazing healthcare thing in place now because of what happened here.
And their own trajectory, though, is different from Sierra Leone or Liberia.
I do think it is on the peace-building agenda, but it's not followed through on. For example, one of the things that South Africa funded in Burundi was an HIV/AIDS center. But when we went to go find the center, it was non-existent. So no follow-through on that. But I'm interested in this whole question of the use of technology. I think it's a good one to explore here. Because it's been used for people to mobilize against particular regimes, but it hasn't been used that effectively in terms of peace building. I know that in the DRC, the UN used it for peacekeeping. In different communities, they receive a cell phone, and if there was any rebel attack, you would phone the UN headquarters, for example. But beyond that, I haven't seen it used. For communities of practice using the internet, etc., I haven't seen much use of technology. Thank you.
The only thing I would say is that maybe one of the unfortunate outcomes is that you're seeing a number of states now developing mechanisms to shut down attempts to use media to mobilize. In the DRC, the very first thing that they did in that week was to shut down internet mobility and things like that. So there's a positive, but now we're seeing all these states are developing sophisticated software, and I think that the latest threat for activists and for people in the field is their own internet security, and that I'm really deeply worried about. We no longer operate safely without information as well. So,
thank you. Right. Colleagues, please join me in thanking our I think that's the closest we can get to. Okay. Thank you very much.